Two hikers, one forest. A discovery that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the end of World War II. October 2024, deep inside the Hürtgen forest in western Germany. Two amateur hikers, off-trail, lost, arguing over a map, notice something strange beneath a tangle of roots and dead brush. A concrete edge, too straight, too deliberate. They start pulling back the undergrowth, and that's when they see it. A hatch, rusted shut. Military-grade steel, bolted into a reinforced concrete frame, half swallowed by the earth. It takes them 40 minutes to pry it open. What they find inside makes them stop breathing. A bunker. Not a standard wartime shelter, but something built to last. Something someone lived in. A Wehrmacht general's uniform hanging from a nail. Maps pinned to the walls marked in red ink. Canned rations stacked floor to ceiling. A ventilation system rigged together from salvaged parts. And sitting on a small wooden desk, a leather-bound journal. The first entry is dated April 1945. That alone would have been remarkable. But here's the detail that sent chills through every historian who later examined the scene. The last entry is dated 1963. Someone was alive down here. Not for weeks, not for months, for nearly 2 decades after the war ended. While Germany rebuilt itself, while the world moved on, one man stayed underground, and no one knew. To understand what was found in that bunker, you have to understand the man who built it. General Friedrich Eckart came from a world that no longer exists. Born 1891 into Prussian military aristocracy. His father was a decorated officer. His grandfather fought in the Franco-Prussian War. Soldiering wasn't a career for the Eckarts. It was blood. Friedrich entered the Kaiser's army at 18. By the time World War I ended, he'd earned an Iron Cross and a reputation for being the calmest man in any room where shells were falling. While others broke down in the trenches, Eckart studied. He mapped enemy positions from memory. He predicted offensives before intelligence confirmed them. Superiors called him cold. The men who served under him called him something else. Alive. Because soldiers near Eckart tended to survive. Between the wars, he rose quietly through the ranks. When Hitler came to power, Eckart kept his distance. He wasn't a party man. Never joined the NSDAP, never wore the swastika voluntarily. He viewed the war as a strategic problem, not an ideological crusade. And for a while, that distinction protected him. The Wehrmacht needed brilliant tacticians more than it needed true believers. But here's what Eckart understood better than almost anyone. When the war ended, and he knew by 1943 it would end badly, that distinction between soldier and Nazi wouldn't matter. Not to the Soviets, who'd execute him on sight. Not to the Allies, who'd try him at Nuremberg. Not to a world looking for someone to blame. Friedrich Eckart had spent his entire life calculating odds. And by early 1945, the odds told him one thing: disappear or die. January 1945. The Eastern Front isn't collapsing, it's disintegrating. The Soviet army is pushing west with a force that defies comprehension. Over 6 million soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks. Artillery barrages so relentless, the ground itself shakes for hours before the infantry even moves. And standing in the path of all of it is General Friedrich Eckart, commanding a sector that exists more on paper than in reality. His divisions are ghosts. Veteran soldiers long dead or captured, replaced by old men pulled from factories, and boys pulled from classrooms. Some of his conscripts are 15. They arrive in uniforms that don't fit, carrying rifles they haven't been trained to fire. Eckhart watches them step off transport trucks and knows most won't survive the week. Supplies have stopped coming. Ammunition is rationed to a handful of rounds per man. Fuel is non-existent. The Luftwaffe hasn't been seen overhead in weeks, and every morning a new directive arrives from Berlin. Hold the line at all costs. Counterattack. Do not retreat under any circumstances. The orders read like they're written by men who haven't looked out a window in months, because they haven't. But it's not the fighting that haunts Eckhart. It's what happens after. The Soviets aren't taking senior German officers prisoner. Not anymore. Stories filter back through the retreating lines. Generals dragged from command posts. Summary executions. Others shipped east to camps where survival is measured in months, not years. Eckhart has heard what happened to captured officers at Stalingrad. Of the 91,000 Germans taken prisoner, only 6,000 ever came home. He doesn't need anyone to explain what capture means. He's done the math. April 1945. Berlin is surrounded. The Reich is dying, and everyone knows it, except apparently the men still sending orders. On April 16th, Eckhart receives what will be his last official communication from High Command. A directive stamped urgent and classified. He reads it twice because the first time he assumes it's a mistake. He is ordered to launch a full-scale counteroffensive against the Soviet advance using the 4th and 9th Reserve Divisions. There's just one problem. Those divisions don't exist anymore. The 4th was annihilated 3 weeks ago near the Oder River. The 9th is scattered across 60 miles of forest with no functioning chain of command. Eckhart is being ordered to attack with an army of dead men. He sets the paper down, looks at the map on the wall. Red arrows pointing west from every direction. Blue positions shrinking by the hour. He's studied enough military history to know exactly what this moment is. This is the end. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now. That night, Eckhart calls a meeting. Not with his full staff, just 4 men. Officers he's served with for years. Men whose loyalty isn't to Berlin or to the party, but to him personally. The conversation lasts less than an hour. No one raises their voice. No one argues. What they decide isn't surrender. Surrender means Soviet custody, and Eckhart already knows how that ends. It isn't a final stand, either. He's not spending the lives of teenage boys for a gesture no one will remember. It's something else entirely. Something Eckhart has been quietly planning since the winter of 1943. A contingency so carefully constructed that when the moment finally comes, the execution takes less than 48 hours. Friedrich Eckhart is going to vanish. The last week of April 1945. Germany is no longer a country. It's a graveyard with borders. Everywhere you look, the machinery of war is eating itself. Soldiers are burning documents by the truckload. Officers ripping insignia from their collars and pulling on civilian clothes. Entire divisions dissolving overnight. Men who commanded thousands walking alone down country roads, hoping no one recognizes their face. It's the largest military collapse in modern history, and in the middle of all of it, one general simply stops existing. Eckhart's sector is overrun on April 27th. Soviet forces push through what's left of his defensive line in under 4 hours. When they sweep the command post, they find maps still pinned to the walls, coffee cups still on the table, but no commanding officer, no body, no trail. His name doesn't appear on any Allied capture list. It's not on any Soviet prisoner manifest. No dog tags recovered from any battlefield. No shallow grave marked with a helmet. Friedrich Eckhart is just gone, like smoke through a cracked window. 3 weeks later, his wife Margareta receives a letter from the Provisional Military Authority. 2 sentences. General Friedrich Eckart status, missing, presumed dead. The letter is unsigned. She reads it standing in the doorway of a borrowed apartment in a bombed-out town 200 miles from the home she'll never see again. She folds it carefully and puts it in a drawer. The Allies note his absence. A British intelligence officer flags the file. An American counterpart adds a question mark next to his name on a list of unaccounted senior officers. But the list has over 3,000 names on it. Eckart's is just one more. The file is shelved. The world has bigger problems. Here's what most people don't understand about the years right after the war. The Allies weren't just rebuilding Europe. They were hunting. Thousands of Nazi war criminals were being tracked across borders, dragged out of hiding, and put on trial. Nuremberg, denazification hearings, entire intelligence networks dedicated to finding the men responsible for the worst atrocities in human history. But Friedrich Eckart didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. And that's exactly what saved him. He wasn't SS. He had no documented connection to the Holocaust. No evidence linking him to massacres or reprisal killings. He was Wehrmacht, a career soldier, the kind of officer who followed the rules of engagement not because he was moral, but because he was disciplined. In the hierarchy of post-war justice, men like Eckart were a problem, too senior to ignore, too clean to prioritize. His name sat on lists, British lists, American lists, Soviet lists, but never at the top, never circled in red. Intelligence officers from 3 nations flagged his disappearance at various points between 1945 and 1948. A British officer in Hamburg noted that Eckart was unaccounted for and possibly alive. An American report from 1947 speculated he may have used rat lines to reach Argentina. A Soviet file suggested he'd been captured and died in transit to a labor camp. None of it was confirmed. None of it was investigated further. Because every week brought a bigger fish. Someone with direct blood on their hands. Someone the public wanted to see punished. Eckart was a question mark in a sea of exclamation points. By 1949, his file was marked inactive. The Cold War had started. Former enemies became new allies. And a missing Wehrmacht general, who probably died in the final days of the war, stopped mattering to anyone. Anyone except his family. While the world forgot about Friedrich Eckart, his family was trying to survive what he left behind. Margaret Eckart and her 2 children fled east in the spring of 1945 with what they could carry. The family estate, a sprawling property that had been in Eckart hands for 4 generations, fell inside the Soviet occupation zone. It was seized within weeks, stripped, repurposed. Everything the family had built over a century gone in a single administrative order. They ended up in a small town in the British zone, a borrowed room above a bakery. Margaret told everyone her husband died in the final days of the war. People nodded. Every second woman in Germany was telling the same story. But neighbors noticed things that didn't quite add up. She never remarried. Not unusual for war widows, except Margaret was still young, still striking. Offers came. She declined every one without explanation. She applied for a war widow's pension, but was denied. No death certificate, no confirmed remains. The government wouldn't declare Friedrich legally dead, and Margaret never pushed them to. As if she knew something they didn't. Then there were the walks. Every few weeks, Margaret would leave the children with a neighbor and disappear for hours, sometimes an entire day. She always walked in the same direction, toward the forest. But here's the detail that still haunts anyone who hears this story. Her daughter Liesel was 7 years old when she first noticed the packages. Brown paper, no label, no return address, left on the doorstep before dawn. Inside, dried meat, canned food, sometimes chocolate. Her mother would collect them without a word. When Liesel asked where they came from, Margaret knelt, looked her daughter in the eye, and said something the girl never forgot. "Don't ever ask about those again." To understand how a man could disappear for 18 years, you first have to understand where he disappeared to. The Hurtgen Forest sits along the German-Belgian border. 130 square kilometers of ancient woodland, so dense that in some places the canopy blocks out the sky entirely. The trees grow tall and close together. Fir spruce and beech packed so tight that after 100 meters off any path, you lose your sense of direction. Sounds get swallowed. Light gets filtered into something gray and heavy. It's the kind of place where you stop hearing birds and start hearing your own breathing. During the war, the Hurtgen was hell. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest was one of the bloodiest and longest engagements on the Western Front. American forces lost over 33,000 men fighting through these trees. The Germans used the terrain like a weapon. Bunkers dug into hillsides, supply tunnels connecting positions underground, defensive lines invisible from 10 feet away. When the fighting ended, the forest was scarred with craters, trenches, and hundreds of small fortified positions, most of which were simply abandoned. After the war, the Allied occupation forces fenced off sections they considered dangerous. Unexploded ordnance, collapsed tunnels, contaminated soil. Warning signs went up. Then the signs rusted, the fences sagged, and slowly the forest took it all back. Locals learned to stay away, not because anyone told them to, but because there was nothing out there worth the trouble. Old bunkers full of water, rusted metal, ground that could collapse without warning. Nothing out there, they'd say, just trees and old bunkers. But that's exactly what made it perfect. Because somewhere deep inside that forest, beneath roots and brush and decades of silence, someone had built something that wasn't on any map, and no one had any reason to look for it. When the forensic team descended into that bunker in October 2024, they expected to find a relic, a forgotten wartime shelter slowly rotting back into the earth. What they found instead made them stand still. This wasn't a standard military bunker, not even close. The original structure was Wehrmacht, poured concrete walls roughly 2 meters thick. Standard design for a small command or storage position, built sometime in 1944. But someone had modified it, extensively, over years. The walls had been reinforced with additional layers of concrete mixed by hand. You could see the difference in texture between the original military pour and the rougher patches added later. A ventilation system ran through the ceiling, fashioned from salvaged exhaust pipes and automotive parts, rigged together with a level of ingenuity that bordered on obsessive. It still worked. 80 years later, air was still moving through those pipes. A water collection system fed rainwater through a series of filters made from sand, gravel, and charcoal into a stone basin near the back wall. Crude but effective. Someone had studied the problem and solved it with whatever they could find. The sleeping area was small, a wooden frame with a straw mattress long since decayed, a wool blanket folded neatly at the foot, military corners. Next to it, a storage section stacked with preserved rations. Some were Wehrmacht issue, stamped with dates from 1944 and 1945. Others were civilian, canned vegetables with commercial labels from the early 1950s, chocolate bars, condensed milk, Someone had been resupplied. And then there was the workspace. A small wooden desk pushed against the far wall, a chair, a kerosene lamp, and sitting in the center of that desk, as if waiting to be found, a leather-bound journal. Here's what chilled investigators to the bone. This bunker wasn't improvised in a panic. The engineering, the planning, the layered modifications over years. This was a man who started building his disappearance long before the war ended. Of everything recovered from that bunker, the journal is what keeps historians up at night. Leather-bound, roughly 300 pages, written in precise, educated German. The handwriting is small and disciplined, the kind drilled into Prussian schoolboys at the turn of the century. No wasted space, no crossed-out words in the early pages. This was a man who thought before he wrote. The first entries are dated April 1945, and they read like field reports, supply inventories, ration calculations down to the calorie, weather observations recorded at the same time every day, security protocols for entering and exiting the bunker, how long to wait after hearing a sound before moving, which routes to use at night, which to avoid. It's methodical, almost mechanical. The writing of a man treating survival like a military operation, because that's the only way he knows how to think. But as the months stretch into years, something shifts. The entries get longer, the discipline starts to crack. By 1947, he's writing about sounds, footsteps that turn out to be deer, engines on roads that may or may not exist, dogs barking in the distance, and the paralysis of not knowing whether they're hunting dogs or farm dogs. He writes about the silence and how it becomes its own kind of noise after long enough. He references his family, but never by name. The older one would be starting school now. I wonder if she still walks the same path. Cryptic, careful, as if he's afraid the journal itself might betray him. One entry from 1952 describes watching a funeral procession through the trees from a hillside above a village road. He counts the mourners, describes the coffin, then writes a single line that stops you cold. I wonder if it was mine. The final entry is dated March 1963, just 3 sentences. The last one reads, "The forest is the only honest place left." After that, nothing, just blank pages. The journal told a story, but it was the objects inside that bunker that proved it was true. Within days of the discovery, a forensic team from the University of Cologne began cataloging everything, every can, every tool, every scrap of paper. What they found didn't just confirm someone had lived there, it confirmed when. Carbon dating on food containers placed the oldest rations squarely in the mid-1940s. Wehrmacht-issue tins with stampings that matched known military supply chains from 1944. But the newer items told a different story. Civilian canned goods with commercial labels from 1951, 1954, 1959. The food didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in waves across nearly 2 decades. The tools showed the same pattern. A military-issue knife worn to the handle from years of daily use. A handsaw with a blade replaced at least twice using different gauge steel. Modifications to the bunker itself corresponded to distinct periods. The original concrete was 1940s military. Patches along the east wall used a civilian cement mixture common in the early 1950s. The ventilation system had been repaired with parts that matched automotive components manufactured after 1957. Someone had lived here across 3 different Germanys: the occupation, the economic miracle, the Cold War. But here's what made investigators stop and look at each other. Among the rations and tools, They found items that had no business being inside a sealed, underground bunker. A newspaper from 1958 folded neatly under the mattress. A transistor radio small enough to fit in a coat pocket. And near the entrance, a pair of civilian leather shoes in a style not manufactured until the mid-1950s.
The soles were worn, mud still caked in the treads. Friedrich Eckart wasn't sealed in that bunker. He was going out, regularly, for years, walking among the very world he was hiding from. Here's the question that changes everything about this story. How does a man survive underground for 18 years alone? The answer is he doesn't. Someone was helping him. Probably more than one someone. After the bunker's discovery, historians began pulling a thread that had been dangling since 1945. Not the famous rat lines, not the dramatic escapes to Buenos Aires or Damascus. Something quieter, smaller. A domestic network operating not across continents, but across a few dozen kilometers of rural Germany. The first clue was the food. Those brown paper packages on Margaret's doorstep weren't charity. They were part of a supply chain. Someone was acquiring civilian goods and delivering them at regular intervals to locations where Eckart could retrieve them.
The logistics alone required at least 2 or 3 people who knew what they were doing and who could keep their mouths shut indefinitely. Investigators started looking at the people who lived near the forest. One name kept surfacing: Heinrich Brauer, a farmer whose property bordered the eastern edge of the Hurtgen. Quiet man, kept to himself. Locals remember him making trips into the forest with a handcart, supposedly collecting firewood. He made those trips for over 15 years, never invited anyone along. Then there was Karl Wendt, a retired quartermaster from Eckart's division, living 2 towns over. Wendt had access to surplus military supplies through a veterans network that operated semi-openly in the 1950s. He died in 1971. His family found nothing unusual in his belongings except a hand-drawn map of the Hurtgen forest with a single location marked by a small X. They never knew what it meant. Now everyone does. The network was fragile, built on personal loyalty, not ideology. Former soldiers bound to their general by years of shared survival. A wife who walked into the forest and never explained why. A farmer who asked no questions. A quartermaster who kept one secret for the rest of his life. Small, deniable, and for 18 years completely invisible. March 1963. The journal stops. And that's where the mystery splits wide open. There's no final goodbye, no dramatic last words, just 3 sentences and then blank pages. The bunker shows no signs of violence, no bloodstains on the walls, no damage to the entrance. The desk is orderly, the blanket folded. Whatever happened to Friedrich Eckart after that last entry, it wasn't sudden and it wasn't a struggle. But a man born in 1891 would have been 72 years old in 1963. 18 years underground in a concrete box with limited nutrition, no medical care, and the psychological weight of total isolation. His body would have been failing. His lungs compromised from years of damp air and kerosene fumes. His joints destroyed. The question isn't whether his health was deteriorating. It's how long he could have lasted once it started. And here's where the trail gets strange. In February 1964, an unidentified elderly man was admitted to a regional hospital in Düren, roughly 30 kilometers from the forest. Severe pneumonia, malnourished. He gave a name that matched no records, no identification, no insurance documents. Staff described him as tall, thin, and unusually formal in his speech. He discharged himself against medical advice after 4 days. A nurse who tried to stop him later told a colleague he looked at her
like she was a subordinate who'd forgotten her rank. He walked out the front door and was never seen again. Then there's the grave, a small village cemetery 12 kilometers south of the forest. One headstone near the back wall. No name, just 2 initials, F.E. No birth date, no death date. Just a cross and 2 letters carved into stone.
The parish has no record of who paid for it or when it was placed. And then the confession. In 1987, Heinrich Brauer's widow lay dying. She called for her pastor. What she told him was recorded in the church's pastoral files and sealed. Those files remain sealed today. But the pastor's grandson, decades later, told a journalist one thing his grandfather had shared with him before dying. She said she helped hide a man in the forest, and she said he died there. Now, let's go back to October 2024. Back to the 2 people who cracked this whole thing open without meaning to. Marcus Heller and Jana Voigt. Both in their early 30s. Weekend hikers. Not experts. Not historians. Just 2 people who liked being outdoors and made one wrong turn that changed everything. They'd been following a trail loop in the northern section of the Hurtgen when Marcus decided to take a shortcut through an unmarked stretch of forest. Jana told him it was a bad idea. He went anyway. 20 minutes later, they were lost. That's when Jana noticed the edge. A straight line in the ground where there shouldn't be one. Nature doesn't make straight lines. She called Marcus over, and they started pulling back brush and dead leaves. Roots had grown over it. Moss covered most of the surface, but underneath was concrete. And then the hatch. They almost didn't open it. Jana wanted to call someone first, but Marcus was already working the rusted latch with a rock. It took 40 minutes. When it finally gave way, the smell hit them first. Stale air, earth, something old and closed off from the world for a very long time. Marcus turned on his phone flashlight and pointed it down. He didn't say anything for about 10 seconds. Then, just one word. Jana. They called police from the nearest point where they could get a signal. Within 48 hours, the site was swarming with forensic teams, historians, and media. The story broke across German news first, then international outlets within a week.
The bunker in the Hurtgen. A general who vanished in 1945 and apparently lived underground until the 1960s. But the people hit hardest by the discovery weren't journalists or historians. They were the Eckharts. Liesel Eckhart was now 86 years old, living in a care home near Aachen. When a historian showed her photographs of the bunker, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she pointed at the wool blanket folded on the bed, military corners. "My mother folded blankets the same way," she said. She told me my father taught her. Liesel's granddaughter, Anna, was 34. She'd grown up hearing that her great-grandfather died in the war, like a million other great-grandfathers. A tragic story, but an old one. Now she was staring at photographs of a bunker 38 kilometers from the house where she grew up, learning that the man her family mourned had been alive beneath the forest floor for nearly 2 decades. Close enough to walk to. "He was right there," Anna said in an interview. "This whole time, we thought he was gone. He was right there." So what do we do with Friedrich Eckhart? It would be easy to call him a coward. A man who abandoned his wife and children to save himself. Who hid in a hole while his country faced the consequences of a war he helped fight. Who let his daughter grow up believing he was dead while he sat 38 kilometers away, writing in a journal by kerosene light. There's a version of this story where he's the villain, and maybe that version is true. But there's another version, a man who saw what was coming before almost anyone else, who understood that the world he'd served his entire life was about to be judged,
and that the judgment wouldn't distinguish between true believers and men who simply followed orders. A man who calculated that surrender meant death or a Soviet labor camp, and that a trial at Nuremberg meant becoming a symbol for crimes he may or may not have committed.
So he made a decision. The same kind of cold, strategic calculation he'd been making his entire career. Except this time, the only life on the line was his own. 18 years. That's how long he stayed underground while Germany rebuilt itself. While the Marshall Plan poured money into cities he couldn't walk through. While his son grew up without a father. While his daughter learned never to ask about brown paper packages. While the Berlin Wall went up and split the country in two. While the world decided what the war meant and who was responsible. The journal doesn't give us answers. It gives us a man slowly coming apart in the dark. A strategist who planned for everything except what solitude would do to his mind. A father who wrote about his children without using their names, because even alone underground, he was afraid of being caught. Was he guilty? Probably. Of what exactly, no one can say for certain. The journal never confesses to anything specific. But innocent men don't dig bunkers in the forest and disappear for 2 decades. Something drove Friedrich Eckart underground, and it wasn't just fear of the Soviets. It was fear of the mirror, fear of what peacetime would force him to confront about the war he helped wage, and the things he chose not to see. The forest kept his secret for 80 years. The hatch is open now. Daylight floods into a room that hasn't seen it since before most of us were born. It falls across a folded blanket, a worn desk, a journal full of words written by a man who tried to outlast his own history. He almost did. Stories like this, they stay with you. You lie in bed at night and your brain just keeps turning it over. What would you have done in his place? Could he have made it out? And before you know it, it's 2 a.m. and you're still wide awake. And if you're someone who deals with that regularly, lying there, mind racing, unable to shut off, I know how frustrating that is. You're exhausted, but your brain just won't stop. And the worst part? The less you sleep, the worse it gets. Your energy crashes, your mood suffers. Everything feels harder than it should. I struggled with this for years. Tried melatonin, white noise, warm milk. Nothing worked long term. Then I found something called the 30-Day Uninterrupted Sleep Reset. It's a science-based program, no pills, no medication, that actually retrains your brain to sleep through the night, 7 to 8 hours uninterrupted. Over 30 days, it rewires your sleep system, and once you're done, you keep the results. There's a maintenance plan, so you don't slip back. Look, if you've tried everything and nothing sticks, this is different. Check the link in the description. Seriously, try it. And I'll catch you in the next story.